I know how to make homemade biscuits because of a woman I never met. And her name was Gladys May. And Gladys May was the wife of a moonshine-making, out-running the law husband who finally channeled that energy into race car driving. Well, when he made it big, he left her for a younger woman. And so Gladys channeled her knowledge of cooking all those years for him and made her fortune that way. She produced cookbooks. And one day I was in the grocery store and saw her name on the back of a bag of flour. Gladys was famous. Well, there was no reason that I shouldn't have known how to make homemade biscuits because I ate them every week. My mama made them. She would get the wooden stool from the kitchen on Saturday morning and put it in front of me. I would sit on the couch and have homemade biscuits and thin gravy with a side of Bugs Bunny cartoons. But when I grew up and I wanted to make biscuits for my own family, I didn't know how. So I called Mama, and she didn't have anything written down. And she would say, oh, a little bit of this, a pinch of that, it should look like this. Well, I was not successful. So I called my granny. And Granny had not only cooked for her family, but she had cooked for the local school. But she didn't have a recipe either. So the only thing I really got from her and Mama was don't overwork your dough and don't overflour your dough. I was scared to death of my dough. Well, in this time of trying and failing at biscuit making, my son, who was in elementary school, evidently blabbed this to the principal. Because one day I came home and there, propped up against my front door, was Gladys May's cookbook. And it was signed on the inside cover. It just so happened that principal's husband, who was a cook, had bought that book and left it at my door. Well, when I looked in there, Gladys had left me all the exact measurements for biscuits. She even said, knead your dough 9 to 12 times. This should make about 12 biscuits. So with practice, I became a really good biscuit maker. I was working at the county finance office, and the retired finance officer gifted everybody in the office at Christmas a box of country ham. So now I had country ham, and I knew how to make biscuits. So on Christmas morning, country ham biscuits. And that became our Christmas tradition. The other tradition that I wanted on Christmas morning was that we wouldn't have family over until about lunchtime so we could have Santa and our country ham biscuits together. But I was always Southern enough to save the rest of the family a ham biscuit for later. Well, it wasn't long after that that I took 2 of my prettiest homemade biscuits to my granny. And Granny was in her living room in her swivel wicker rocker that is really garden furniture, but she thinks out of the box. And she was sitting there surfing cable TV channels, and she was going across all the music channels, and she let it rest on one that was singing Ruby Baby. And underneath on the screen it read, first on TV in 1963. Well, I said to Granny, what were you doing in 1963? And she relaxed in her rocker and spread out her hands and closed her eyes, and her face relaxed. And while she time traveled in her head, I did math in mine. And I think she must have been about 36 that year. As she started talking, she said, your grandpa and I lived in that plank house up in the mountains, and we had to stuff newspapers in between the planks to keep out that cold air. And we had one car that he drove to work, and we had our two youngins. And I was the cook with one other woman at the school. And I said, well, I interrupted. How did you get to work if you only had one car? And she said, well, I just rode the school bus with my kids. I could not get on the bus and give my kid a lunchbox. It was against the rules. I said, well, how did you cook breakfast? They didn't serve breakfast back then at school, she said. She said, but the government sent the best meat. They would send whole turkeys, and we would cook that turkey, and we would use every bit of it. We made good home-cooked meals. And she said, and I made homemade yeast rolls. And while she was talking, I was remembering that people in the community, older than me, but younger than Granny, would tell me how at the end of the day, if there was food left, she would give it to the children who did not have enough at home. So the next day or so, shortly after that, I had the opportunity to add photographer assistant to my resume. So the photographer happened to be my sister, and she had to go and do a session at an African American Family of Life celebration / reunion. And so when we got there, we were out in the country in what looked to be a small community center. And we went in, and one of the family members named John came over to us, and he asked us if we needed anything. What could he help us with? And my sister said, well, she needed to look for a place for the backdrop for the family photo. And she wanted to look outside and see if there was any place out there. And so we went outside. And on one end of the building, there were two doors that would have opened out of the building. And she really liked those two doors. They looked really old. They were flaked with red paint, but we couldn't get to them. It was like half of the building had just been chopped off, and those two doors was just opening into a chain link fenced area. So we went back inside and asked John if he could help. And he went over, and those doors had not been opened in a long time. But he opened up the doors, and he took a broom and brushed the cobwebs away, and we went out. When you opened up the doors and walked out in that chain-linked fenced-in area, you were standing on a concrete slab. And he turned around to tell us, he said, now, this one door over here did open up into the younger children's classroom up to 3rd grade at one time. And this door over here opened up into the kids' classroom, the older kids, 4th through 8th grade. He said, I went to school here. He said that this land that we were standing on had been given to slaves in the 1800s so they could have a place for a school or a church. And as he talked further, I realized that we were standing on the ground of what once had been a segregated school. He pointed to a place on the concrete slab. He said, I was sitting right there the day they announced that John F. Kennedy was shot. He said, I was right there beside the wall and the radiator. Well, that wall and radiator were gone. It was just that chain link fence. And, I told him, I remember my own mama telling me where she was in high school that day when they announced that JFK had been shot and how they had all cried. And he said, yes, JFK had been his hope. Well, he told me to look, and I looked through the chain link fence right behind that spot he pointed to. Across the road was this run-down house that looked like it had been bright yellow at one time. And he said the school cook lived over there. And she would walk here to school, and she made the best yeast rolls for the whole school. Well, he went back inside, and I said to my sister, I said, do you think he would like his picture made at that spot he pointed out to us? And she said she didn't know, and she was a little hesitant to ask because that's really not what they had hired her, what she'd been hired to come there and do. And I exercised my big sister rights and just told her, well, I'll go ask and blame it on me. So I asked him, and yes, he would. He would like his picture. And so we put a chair. Was it at this spot? Yes, it was about at that spot. And behind him, you could see through what had been the wall and the cook's house, and my sister took his picture. And he was just pleased. He'd always had a story, but now he had a picture to go with it. And he said, I'm going to hang this on my office wall. I don't know why our lives cross the way they do, but John and my mama are not all that different. They were both in school in 1963 when they had this news that shocked the nation. My granny and the school cook at John's school aren't all that different. Granny was stuffing newspaper and planks in the walls of her house, and that lady was walking to her work. And so I just think about that and how we're all so much more alike than we even recognize. And I am glad that my paths cross with all kinds of people everywhere, and with Gladys May, our paths never crossed. But if it hadn't been for her, I wouldn't know how to make a homemade biscuit.